Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, regardless of where in the world that you're finding yourself situated right now. Welcome to our session, which is a digital brainstorm with some amazing hearts and minds that we've got on the panel with us today. Today, we are going to be provoking and pushing at the topic of no, you don't need an app for this. Why the accountability puzzle will not be solved by digital fixes. So we have an amazing panel. This is going to be a fantastic organic conversation. We really also want to pull in audience participation as quickly as possible. So audience members, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a question and comment box. So do put your questions in there for our panelists as we go through. They will be curated and we can post them through our panelists at any time over the next hour and a half. So I'm privileged to be able to host and moderate this conversation with our amazing group of panelists. We've got with us Catherine Green, who's the Humanitarian Accountability Advisor at World Vision. Meg Sattler, who's the Director of Ground Truth Solutions and also a board member of the Humanitarian Innovation Fund and former innovator working on inclusive tech and connectivity with CDAC, Start Network, WFP, and OCHA. Paul Keneally, who is currently the Global Head of Communications for LiveTiles, the leading digital workplace and employee engagement company in the world. And Max Morell, who is currently the Director of Operations at Foundation Hirondelle, overseeing programs that run media and train journalists in fragile contexts. Previously, he worked as the Director of Medicine du Monde in Switzerland, as well as working in the field with MSF. We were going to also be joined by Roya Pogsod, who's the founder and director of Taraz, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. And I am Arathi Krishnan, who has worked in the humanitarian space for a very long time, and I'm currently a research fellow at Harvard, researching on how we decolonize humanitarian digital policy. So it is my privilege and honor to be here today. I'm going to turn over to our amazing panelists to get us kicked off. This topic is broad, it's provocative. What are your initial reactions to it? Meg, I might start with you.
Thank you very much. I think for me, I guess the now trending today, Ollie Luff term of digital litter kind of says it all to me. I think if there was some sort of digital magic bullet for accountability, we definitely would have found it by now. I'm increasingly feeling like almost every new tech innovation that I see that is aimed at solving accountability problems not only saps shrinking humanitarian funding, but at a more sinister level, I think it's actually increasingly distracting us from the fact that huge humanitarian agencies are still not accountable to anyone except their biggest donors. And so I think creating these gimmicky solutions and apps and little kind of tech fixes for community engagement under the guise of accountability feels like a very big irony to me.
That's a big poke that humanitarian organizations you feel are not accountable to anybody but their donors. Interesting. Paul, what about you? What are your initial reactions to this topic?
My initial reactions are that, yeah, I mean, if as Meg says, you know, we're talking about throwing technology at a problem, we're doing technology for technology's sake, and it's gimmicky, etc., then I fully agree with her. However, I do believe technology can be a very important part, and digital in particular can be a very important part of the accountability and community engagement challenge that's ongoing. The discussion reminds me a little bit about, you know, back in the 70s or 80s, or whenever Graham Hancock wrote his famous book on the Lords of Poverty and documented, you know, tractors and combine harvesters being thrown into agricultural, as an agricultural fix in places like Ethiopia. And what it was doing at the end of the day was destroying the soil and totally ignoring the innovation and the local knowledge of the communities. I think it's not dissimilar what we're talking about now. If you throw a tech solution at a challenge in somewhere like, Myanmar or Bangladesh or northeastern Nigeria or Iraq or wherever, transplanted out of its original environment, it's not going to make much of a difference, if any. It could even make the situation worse. But if you involve the community and study and learn from the community in terms of how technology is being used in a valuable way for them, then that's your starting point to developing really good solutions and marrying the human and digital ecosystems together to have real impact and real scale.
Fantastic. I think that's a really good point. I wonder how much we have learned over the decades we've done humanitarian work about exactly when we engage communities. And I think that can be quite rife as well, but really, really good points, Paul. Catherine, I'm going to go over to you. What are your initial reactions to the topic?
Thanks, Arathi. Well, as someone speaking today, as Meg said, from a big NGO who is definitely accountable to its donors, I would hope that we are also trying to be, and in a lot of cases, being accountable to the communities that we work in. But I would say that having worked for a humanitarian innovation consortium in the past and seeing lots of these solutions come into the field, I just don't think that we as a sector are very good at innovating and at actually shepherding in these new solutions and going through the necessary processes to actually take an idea from an idea to actually scaling and having it meet the needs of people. And I think in one of the other sessions, there was talk of, we have a lot of solutions looking for problems rather than problems looking for solutions. And, taking it one step further from what Paul was saying about, innovations that actually involve the community, I think going one step further, actually looking at the innovations that already exist in the community and supporting them and creating the necessary environment to actually support them to scale and address problems that are existing within that context. And I think speaking from maybe an accountability perspective, a lot of organizations were very quick to be like, oh my God, quick, we've got to go digital. And I actually think that the beginning of a pandemic is the wrong time to start to introduce a new solution. That needs to be part of our preparedness planning as a sector, making sure that we are identifying what are the preferred channels of communication before a crisis, and then making sure that we have in position the appropriate technology that can scale or can be, scaled up and down as contexts change.
Wonderful, Catherine. I really like your point about that we're struggling with that shepherding process of technologies. Max, over to you. Initial thoughts.
So in general, I'm a skeptic when it comes to innovation. I feel like I've been attending certain discussions, maybe a little bit like this one, over 10 years, and each time I say, oh, there's someone else talking about how tablets will change everything. Oh, well, now drones are going to change everything, and then algorithms, how we can amass a lot of data and then push it through some sort of processing and then come out with the magic bullet. I think one of the things that's been maybe a continuing line in my experiences in humanitarian situations is regarding the power of humanitarian actors themselves and other stakeholders in the situations. And if we're talking about accountability, we're also talking about trust, right? Accountability also has a measure to do with trust. We're talking about accountability towards the affected populations. So for me, all these solutions regarding tablets, drones, algorithms can't compete with old-fashioned journalism, using a journalist in the community, someone who is familiar with the affected community or who's part of the affected community and is able to report on what's going on, to a larger group of people using just FM radio, stuff that's been existing for over 80 years. So I tend to be a bit of skeptic as far as what we can do with technology.
Hey, so nothing can replace our analog approaches regardless of what those analog approaches are. Okay, a lot of you have talked about that, you know, we're not doing this so well, but where are humanitarian organizations going wrong in all the myriad approaches to tap into tech for the silver bullet, so to speak? What exactly is it that we're doing wrong in this space? I'm going to open this up to anybody. Just unmute yourself and jump in. But yeah, I'm keen to sort of unpack that a little bit.
I'm happy to kick off. I think that one of the issues is that I think a lot of the issues that we try to address through tech innovation are actually systemic issues. And so I think it's become a bit of a dangerous game in our sector, as Max was touching on, where we sort of take a massive problem and then try and throw these little sort of product-based innovations at it. Whereas I think by and large, you know, the problems, particularly surrounding accountability, are just so systemic that that's always going to be quite difficult. If you look for an example at the number of attempts to collect feedback online because of COVID-19, I think this has drawn some important data, but that's only a very minuscule part of the story because of who was able to provide that information and how it was analysed. If you look at the issues that have made access difficult for humanitarian responders during COVID-19, none of them have really been caused by a lack of technology. So therefore, suddenly throwing technology at problems that are wrapped up in, you know, foreigner-heavy leadership models and community connectivity issues that are linked inherently to power structures and gender inequality and income inequality, those systemic issues are the ones that require the innovating. But as Catherine said, that needs to happen well before a humanitarian crisis kind of sets in. And so I think because we take this simplistic approach to tech and innovation, we sort of risk as a sector either exposing or actually worsening existing inequalities.
Does everybody agree with that on that point about worsening inequalities? I think Catherine and then maybe Max.
I just wanted to to maybe add to what Meg was saying about perhaps some of the reasons you know, why we're just a bit crap at this, and I think some of it is to do with the adoption of a model of innovation that's just not, you know, it's just not fit for context. You know, I think a lot of our models have been brought over wholesale from, you know, the corporate sector or Silicon Valley, you know, where there is a very different context and certainly, you know, some failed innovations that I have been part of. You know, it's really clear to see where we've gone wrong because the assumptions behind the innovation models are just totally different. Like, you know, we're in the humanitarian world, we're bound by a set of humanitarian principles that just don't exist, you know, in other innovation contexts. The appetite for risk from our donors is very different, and some of the evidence that we, you know, that other kind of corporate sector innovations measure themselves by are just not the kind of outcomes that we're looking for in a humanitarian space. And I think that at the end of the day, the user is, you know, is not a purchaser. You know, these are people that if we, you know, fail fast and, you know, we have the potential to do more harm than good. And that's definitely, you know, I've definitely seen that in some cases. And if not doing a lot of damage, then just wasting a lot of money and breaking some of that trust between agency and community that you need to be able to do really good accountability work and hold, you know, hold yourself accountable.
Max?
Yeah, I do agree. And I think one of the key elements we're missing here is the importance of the human factor. One, in the relationship between the humanitarian agencies and the affected populations and the users. And two, to be able to act as a mediator and to be able to discern what's going on and to make judgment calls that it's very difficult for tech to do. To use the example of Facebook in Myanmar, it's an example of making a situation even worse, exploiting and amplifying biases against the Rohingya in a society and making them more acceptable, more exploitable, and less accountable. Those voices were often anonymous. The worst of those voices were often anonymous, and therefore the accountability problem is made worse. So although Facebook isn't a specific solution for the humanitarian environment, it is an example of how tech has gone and actually made our job even harder by taking out the human element that's so important, and we risk making that same mistake when we rely too heavily on digital solutions.
That's a great segue, a little bit of a segue to a question that's just been posed to you from the audience. And the question is, a major challenge is connectivity. Lots of tools need lots of connectivity to work, but it's not available in many places. So any ideas on how to make connectivity better? Or should we disconnect digital tools from needing continuous connectivity?
I can jump in there, Rathi. Also, prior to my current position, I spent 7 years with the International Telecommunications Union, the UN agency, who's all about connectivity and digital inclusion. I would be a big advocate for either partnering with organizations that can understand and provide connectivity where it's appropriate and where it's needed. And I do think that should be something that NGOs, aid organizations consider and invest in. One of the most recent countries that I've visited in terms of community engagement was Iraq, for instance, and there it was very clear that the Wi-Fi was an extremely important factor for women to connect with each other in the community, because they had access to smartphones, they had access to sometimes to laptops through their daughters or whatever, and if they had connectivity to Wi-Fi, it really opened up their world to information and social contact, etc. But going also back to the previous question, where have aid agencies fallen down in terms of implementing digital solutions? I'd say 3 things very quickly. I think partnership is absolutely key. If you're of the mindset that you have a great digital solution that's going to solve a problem in a particular country without understanding what's going on in that community and where the resources and skills and knowledge is in that community, then you've already basically missed the point. So I think that partnership with tech accelerators, with incubators, etc., is far better than creating your own, in my own opinion. It's a shame to hear that there have been bad experiences with some digital solutions in different contexts. I'm sure there's some good ones as well. But if you want to really tap into lots of different demographics and groups in the community, you're going to have a really good understanding of the information ecosystem. That goes without saying, and quite often that will require digital. I mean, in Myanmar, where I was as well, and in Bangladesh, YouTube and Vimeo, or YouTube and Viber, was extremely important for the younger sections of society, for instance, who could become very powerful relays of information to the older, their older parents or wider family network. So I think in order to really benefit from that, you absolutely need to leverage the potential that technology can have and understand it. And then there's the issue of data. I mean, the insights that data can provide you. done properly, will benefit massively in operation if it's done well. So I think these are issues to consider: that scale, that data, and the partnership. If if bringing into doubt the efficacy of a digital solution.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was really insightful. And I'm drawing the links between what you've just said, but also to something that Catherine said earlier around the types of partnerships we're forming, and assuming that that's just going to be able to replicate it well. And just pick up on both what you and Max have talked about, I want to go to my next question. In the past few years, many technology companies, we've partnered with humanitarian and government agencies to provide tech support and tools for addressing refugees' needs. What are your thoughts? I mean, there's obviously a tension here. We need to partner, we need to bring in expertise. There's the cultural applicability and approaches. General thoughts about such partnerships, and how can we actually find ways to improve these partnerships for solutions that actually benefit and provide value for the work that we do? Catherine, I might go to you.
Sure. Well, I might answer actually with a bit of a case study or an example from Somalia. I actually think that during the COVID response, they did an excellent job of using digital to communicate, because they already had in place a partnership with a local mobile network operator and a local digital platform that enabled IVR and two-way communication between communities. They had already done an accountability and assessment to determine that communities preferred this method of two-way communication. And so for them, they were able to, scale this up in the COVID response. But I think what was really interesting when I was talking to them about, because I was looking for some case studies and some good stories of where digital platforms really worked. And they were saying, oh, well, we did have another partnership with a different digital platform provider that wasn't a local digital platform provider in the past. And we spent a lot of money and that, that kind of, it all went quiet, the conversation. And I poked a little bit more, and it turned out that it was a digital platform that was outside of Somalia. It didn't really understand the context. The maintenance and the upkeep sat with this organization. And so that access to the story, that the data of the community, of the calls coming in and going out, as Paul said, was not available for the organization to be able to make informed decisions, change and adapt programming based on that. So I think that some of those, the partnership is such a key piece of the success. I think that Rob in one of the other sessions mentioned about, that if they were going to develop a solution, they would develop it in-house. Personally, if World Vision was to say, let's develop something in-house, I would say, absolutely don't do that. I just don't think we have the skills to do that. So I think that, we are going to, as humanitarian organizations, we do, humanitarian stuff well. So I think we are going to have to look for partners in the digital space. And we need to be able to know what we're looking for in these digital partners. And so having a really clear idea of what it is that we're looking for in a partner, and bringing in those things like, well, who owns the data? Where does the maintenance sit? Who can access the data? How are the messages transmitted? The cost involved? All of those kind of things can make or break, the success of a digital partnership.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. That's really helpful. Meg, I want to come to you. GTS spends a lot of its time facilitating conversations with people affected by crises about what they think of the aid effort. Do these conversations provide any insight into ways tech can be more inclusive or to be used for greater effect for accountability or participation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of touching on my opening remarks, I think looking at kind of the sum total of most of our data, people just don't feel heard overall. And I think that's kind of the main thing. And so in trying to find more actionable data than that, you know, we do go into these processes of asking people what their preferred ways of providing feedback are. You know, we do sort of questions around that. There's a lot of different needs assessments around that. And what we get from that is obviously quite mixed. And so, you know, you will find in a lot of places people would very much prefer to communicate via SMS or maybe through, you know, a social media channel, through radio, through computers, whatever it is. I think what we're seeing now, though, which is a bit of a worrying trend, is that because information needs assessments have taken off so much, they are becoming another thing that are being sort of equated with accountability. So rather than us sort of saying, okay, we have this data now in this community about how people might want to receive feedback or participate or receive information or whatever it is, we tend to just keep duplicating these assessments and then saying, well, we've done an information needs assessment, so therefore, you know, we're sort of doing accountability. We're not seeing so much that people understanding more about channels necessarily means that a lot of aid actors are using them, if that makes sense. I think we're also seeing from people that the way, and this sort of touches on the previous question, but people do have their preferred ways of kind of existing in the world. And when a humanitarian response happens, if technology providers can come in and support them in the background, that will tend to be quite effective for people who we speak to. So an example of this is in Iraq, where everyone wanted to come in with a mobile money system, either one that they'd created as an organization or one that they could create as a consortium of organizations. But that didn't go down very well in the interviews that we did in Iraq, because in Iraq, they have this system that is used by the government called a QI card for pensions and things, which would be the most user-friendly option. But a lot of times aid agencies sort of, for whatever reason, just aren't willing to kind of exist in the background such that they would support, I guess, a mechanism like that. You know, everyone wants to create their own. I remember there was a tension a while back between LMMS and Scope and, you know, all these kind of things where people want credit for the solutions that they're taking. And I guess just a final point that I would make is also about nuance, and something that we learn increasingly from our conversations, which I guess is quite obvious. But I think there is a bit of a gap between how people would prefer to engage in a response and how humanitarians as a sector kind of understand the processes towards that. In Bangladesh, for example, we've recently learned that even the presence of a tablet in a face-to-face interview can completely change the dynamic of a conversation with someone from a Rohingya community. So while we're thinking about shifting to paper-based forms there, we also are aware that those very same people may then go and spend half the day on WhatsApp talking to their friends and family, because humans are complex, as is their relationship with technology. And so I think if we've learned anything, it's just that we need to approach many of these things with a lot more nuance and critical thought to be able to kind of really understand where people are at. I think we're not quite there yet.
That just really sparked off a whole bunch of other questions. So I'm going to riff off what you just said a little bit. There was layers to what you were pointing to, talking to, Meg, and I'm keen to get Max, Catherine, and Paul's thoughts on this. So I'm riffing, so do forgive me. But you talked about that we're all wanting to just be the leader in promoting the solution. Have we lost our way? Is this the fundamental issue here, that we're not actually our focus has gone from us wanting to be the leader, the winner, the person that solved it, the sort of savior idea, rather than actually what's needed in the context that we're working in and what people actually want? Is that the I guess the elephant in the room? I'll open this up.
I mean, I think in some cases that might be what's happening. I think in some other cases, especially if there's donors involved, there is an obligation and an expectation that there will be some branding, maybe some, some income generation for a particular organization. So I think there might be some, of that happening. But I also think that, the needs of communities and the preference of communities change. And so, it needs to be a continual, like Meg said, that it needs to be nuanced, and that listening needs to happen continually, so that we're not just saying, once in, at the beginning of a 3-year project or at the beginning of a response even, oh, okay, well, we know communities prefer, using SMS, so we'll just use that for the next 2 years. So, yeah, I mean, the cynical part of me is like, okay, maybe there are, maybe that is the case, but I think there's probably some other drivers there as well around who holds the purse strings, expectations there, where the decisions are coming from. And then I also think that there are changing preferences from the community that we need to just listen to better.
Very
Going back to some of the previous discussions this morning, I think of Adelina and Samello in particular. Samello said that, there will need to be some discomfort experience. There will need to be a change in power structures that have become very much institutionalized in a discriminatory way in terms of institutions making decisions with relation to responding to some of the complex situations that we're talking about now. And Adelina was talking about, it's time for the leadership to move into the countries that have experienced the disasters. Now, for that to happen, we need to measure things from a different paradigm and understand things in a different paradigm. If we just flip the discussion for a second, for instance, I read recently that one of the major issues in Melbourne linked to COVID-19 was a failure to communicate to some of the minority and marginalized groups in the city, failure to communicate effectively in the different dialects of Chinese or different languages that might have had. Now, can you imagine an aid organization arriving into the city of Melbourne and with their own solutions, with their own mobile money app, saying, okay, you guys have your own, but ours is, we're going to use ours because, it's better. That's unthinkable, right? You would plug into the city infrastructure, you'd use their systems, and we have to do that more and more. I mean, this is part of the discomfort. And it is true, it is an elephant in the room, it's been in the room for a long time, that there is a competition of different solutions that are bespoke and made in-house and totally ignoring the potential to either partner with local government agencies or local agencies to get things done much more effectively, much more collaboratively, and in a much more localized manner. So I think that definitely is something that needs to be done if we truly want to shift the dynamic in how communities are engaged and how aid is working in the 21st century.
Thank you, Paul. I fully agree with that. I might, if Max didn't want to jump in, but I might actually link this to the next question that I have. How do we make sure that concerns of affected populations are systematically prioritized above those of institutions, including humanitarian agencies? Because, Paul, I so agree with you. The idea of going into Melbourne and saying, here's a solution we've designed for you is unthinkable. Therefore, why is it thinkable in some of the contexts that we work in? And we've often said for a very, very, very long time, yes, communities have to be consulted and engaged. We're still not, 2020, we're still not doing it well. Why? So how can we actually make this better in a much more systemic way? What are the shifts that need to happen?
maybe I can just jump in with one comment. I mean, I think in some places we do actually have the ability to, we do have systems in place in some contexts where we are hearing the preferences of community and feedback from communities. But I think there's still a challenge, even where there are good systems in place, to hear community feedback about, no, this program isn't wanted, or no, we'd prefer that, or, that sucks what you're doing there, or the quality is bad. But I think there's still some challenges to actually, even when we're hearing that community feedback loud and clear, to have organizational leadership and, leadership within organizations to say to our donors, who, as Meg said at the beginning, we are accountable to them, to say, actually, I know that you've funded us to do X, Y, and Z, but here is the evidence from the community to say we need to completely change what we're doing. And I think that takes some balls to be able to do that. And it needs, that needs leadership from, from organizations to say, we are unashamedly going to have hard discussions with our donors and within our organization, to say that we will follow what the communities are telling us that they want.
I think if I could just add to that, just because from the kind of small part that ground truth plays in this picture, something that we've really learnt is that, exactly as you said, there's kind of two major parts to what we do. And I think people see ground truth as collecting data. But the thing that's harder for us is what we call kind of the dialogue stage of what we do, which is where we spend months for every kind of data collection exercise that we do, trying to kind of win hearts and minds in a response setting to work out who are the leadership who can actually make decisions based on this data, who is going to put pressure on them to be able to do that. How do we convince them that what we've done is sort of statistically sound enough that they would even listen to it in the first place? And for that, it's interesting because while there seems to be now this kind of, I guess, multitude of different accountability mechanisms, we find that our biggest target audiences tend to be response leadership and their donors, because we know that no matter how many people are kind of doing accountability in terms of community engagement activities, nothing is going to change unless someone is actually held accountable somewhere for actually listening to that feedback, which is much more important than just gathering it, which in some ways is definitely the easier part. Which I guess, circling back to this topic of the whole forum, is kind of why the skepticism of technology comes in, because I think there's often this desire to create a platform or a system or a dashboard. The amount of times that ground truth gets asked to make dashboards and we don't, because we know that even though that would be an easy thing for us to do and it would keep us all employed, we know that that's not what is going to make a difference. And so I think it's just so much bigger than the actual sort of technology or the activity. It's so much more about dialogue and convincing and advocacy and accountability, which is just so much bigger than any individual solution.
Agree. Max, did you want to jump in? I
did, and I've been informed that I have a slight whizzing sound when I speak, so hopefully my intervention is clear enough. I think whenever we talk about communication, we're talking about somebody with an agenda. And the issue with that is that we're dealing with populations that have been traumatized oftentimes by whatever's going on and that are highly mistrustful. And even though we may feel like, and we have the best of intentions as humanitarian actors, it will be understood by the people we are seeking to serve that we have some sort of agenda. And as it was rightly said just moments ago, the data we're collecting, we're not necessarily sharing with the people that we're speaking with. It's for us to better our interventions, to better serve the people, but it's for us, so we maintain the power. So I think one of the key issues here is recognizing the importance of local media. Oftentimes, not always, there can be big problems, but oftentimes there will be some level of trust that's built up by local radio stations or other local media actors with the local population. They know who is talking to them because they've heard that voice over the radio for whatever time, for years perhaps. And so using those channels to be able to have interviews, to be able to have interviews both with affected populations to bring up their own concerns, and also to see if we can get interviewed, not controlling the entire agenda, but with a mediator who is autonomous and who, if they're doing journalism the right way, has the interests of the affected population at heart. And therefore, the trust issue can be overcome, I think, because we're expressing our own point of view. They know we have our own agenda, good or not, but then we let them be responsible for judging it. And that's a little bit of the difference between journalism and communication is, unfortunately, when we are communicating, there is some sort of a hidden agenda there, even if it's benevolent, even if it's, we think in the interest of the others. We need to give the others some agency, and I think it's through journalism that we can do that.
I like that point, Max, and I think your reflection on the agenda, even if it's unconscious, is always there. We find ourselves often reducing community participation down to a data point to further our own institutional mandate, without that sort of reverse back. And we talk a lot about facilitating, agency, etc., but it's a very hard behavioral shift to point. And I like your reflection around that difference between communication and journalism. We've got a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to put to the panel. So our first one, a major challenge, how do we solve the problems of the control and confidentiality of channels? How do we beat that? Or do we still have to put some conditionality for their use by some compared to others? If anybody wants to grab that one. Solving the problems of control and confidentiality of channels.
I can start to have a couple of thoughts about that. I think that control and confidentiality around channels also depends on what type of information we're trying to share and what type of information we are receiving. So in some cases during COVID, where many of the officers went to remote two-way communication, we know that people prefer to give face-to-face communication or face-to-face feedback when it relates to sensitive matters. So maybe complaints that relate to SEA or complaints about staff behaviour or things like that. So I think that, as with everything, it's nuanced and it needs some discussion, and it needs consultation with communities around preferred channels for what type of information they want, that they're asking for and that they're needing, and the types of channels that for different types of feedback. So I think it also depends on what information is going both ways in those channels when you're thinking about confidentiality.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. I hope that answered the audience questions. I want to perhaps jump to a few points around COVID. What digital solutions did work during COVID, and what can we learn from that?
I can touch on that a little bit, again, probably with a bit of nuance. I think like many people, we shifted pretty quickly to phone surveys, which has been incredibly challenging. I think I would say it's worked in the sense that, particularly if it was a community that was communicating that way anyway, it just became sort of an easier way to facilitate those discussions. But I would say that by and large, a positive is how much we have learned as ground truth and hopefully as a sector about how difficult this actually is. I think that we've been trying to share a lot of the lessons that we've learned, often the hard way or through making mistakes, to be honest, with the sector. Because I think something that we have seen has been this proliferation of phone survey data that's kind of been blasted everywhere. And what has been positive for us is that we've started to think really, really critically about every facet of doing a phone survey. So rather than just saying, you know, here's an area, we would have gone there face to face, let's try and find a list. We have to ask ourselves so many questions about how do the elements come together to trust that phone-based data? Where are your lists coming from? How many calls do you need to make to reach one person that's going to help you get up to your sample size? What biases come into play in that process? How do you know that you're reaching vulnerable groups? And a lot of that we've been able to get around through, you know, waiting or doing backup key informant interviews, or where it's been safe, supplementing phone surveys with face-to-face. And the reason I say that's a positive, not a negative, is that I think we've just learned so much about how to get around some of these difficulties by just being really honest with ourselves. That hopefully, if this is kind of our new normal, we're not just going to be in a situation where we're just doing phone surveys and thinking that that is the same as doing face-to-face surveys. But rather we're becoming so critical on ourselves as a sector that we're kind of able to demonstrate gaps in our own knowledge and then maybe work a bit harder to fill them. So I think maybe previously we were all lulled into a bit of a false sense of security in terms of, you know, it's easy to talk to communities because you can kind of walk down the road and talk to them. I think now we are learning a lot and facing a lot of hard truths also about why it is that access is difficult. Like, is access difficult because maybe we weren't the people who should have been having those conversations in the first place? So I think there are a lot of positives that have come out of this that I think will continue to sort of speed up a lot of agenda reform items in the humanitarian space, if that makes sense.
Really valid point, Meg. Thank you. Paul, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could jump in more from what's happening in the business world and the private sector, because it has really COVID-19 has forced a lot of organizations to adapt really quickly, and timeframes have completely changed. Their timelines, you know, the organizations that we would work with that might have a digital transformation plan for 3 years has now become 3 weeks. And we work with a lot of not-for-profit organizations as well. But one of the things we've seen, which has been really useful during COVID, and it's been quite interesting for me coming from the humanitarian background to see it in the private sector, because there's a lot of the similar challenges and issues, definitely on clear communication, but also on you know, the feeling of isolation, stress, being overwhelmed, etc., that a lot of employees are experiencing due to this sort of disruption and working from home. I myself have been working from home since March. I mean, I would never have ever thought that that would ever be a feature of my life, for instance. So one thing that's been working really well with all of the customers that we're dealing with is this pulse. I wouldn't call them surveys, or like check-in pulses, just to get feedback, very quick, very unobtrusive from end users. So I mean, some of the organizations would have 40,000, 50,000 employees. So it's over time, you get a really good insight into how your employees are doing and how they're coping and what they need, etc. So there's potentially a lot of lessons there that could be used very effectively in the sort of environments that humanitarian and development organizations are working in.
Really, really good points, Paul. Thank you for sharing that. Meg, I wanted to come back to your reflection earlier on, maybe we shouldn't be the ones asking the question. There was a quote floating around I saw a couple of months ago that really resonated with me, that before coming up, as we're in this new, I guess, these new learnings and unlearnings that 2020 is unearthing for all of us, as we're coming up with fixes, tech fixes, in addition to asking if these are the right tech fixes, we should also be asking if we should be the ones coming up with it in the first place, or even doing anything about it in the first place. And so your comment really resonated with me on that. We have another question from the audience, and this is a brilliant one. Not to make it competitive for the rest of the audience members, but this is a brilliant question. Are donors a scapegoat in this discussion? Donors often are flexible on adapting programs and removing or adapting the technology. So is it the INGO and UN agencies that micromanage their preferred ways of working and don't enable the change to take place?
Can I start?
Great. I love that question. Go for it.
It's one of my favorite. I think sometimes donors are scapegoats. I think there is kind of a narrative around donors, and they are very easy to blame for a lack of accountability across a number of spheres. I would say, rather than donors being scapegoats, there are a few things that I think they could tweak that would really move the needle. One of them is exactly what Catherine said before, which was if they did actually demand more action on feedback. So I think often people point to a lack of accountability being tied to a lack of flexibility from donors. But I think it's not necessarily even that lack of flexibility. I think it's if they were a bit more specific in terms of what accountability meant, as those who do hold the purse strings for almost the entire sector. I think that, I've been in conversations personally with heads of responses where I've said, honestly, Meg, they have said, honestly, Meg, I would do more about this if our donors told us to, but they haven't. So therefore, I'm not going to. I will say, though, I think that there is also a United Nations problem in this. I think that because donors, for a multitude of reasons, rightly and wrongly, do continually entrust UN agencies to sort of play that middle donor role, where they take a lot of funding and then they hand it out to other agencies. And this chain of accountability sort of falls down where, the kind of bottom of the pile in terms of implementing partners that have gone so far down the chain that they're the last ones. They might be held to a level of account for doing things that are difficult and community engagement and all this sort of stuff. But the UN agencies themselves very rarely have to demonstrate that they're being accountable at all. And so I think that a combination of some UN reform and some donor reform could really actually change a lot of things in the sector. And I think that maybe they could do with being scapegoats a bit more often, I would say.
Good point, Meg.
I would also add to that, Meg, to say, similarly, if donors were asking for it more, then it would be done more. I also think that within organisations, once you have leadership, especially within a response or, more globally, modelling and saying, I want to see how you've taken community voices into account with not just, tactical changes, not just like, the community said they want a pink bucket, so we changed the buckets from blue to pink, not tactical changes. But if leadership is really insisting and demanding that strategic decisions and resource allocation within organisations and within response design comes from community, then I think that can also make a really big difference as well.
It could go one step further as well. I would propose that organizations, humanitarian organizations, are maybe held more to account by donors in terms of the due diligence that they are putting in place for the solutions that they're delivering in different countries. So, for instance, if you're running a feedback platform in let's say Myanmar, have you gone and sought out Myanmar's equivalent to Loop, for instance? Are you working with local innovators? Are you working with local knowledge? If the knowledge is not there to your satisfaction, are you prepared to invest in it to help develop it? Maybe that is one of the single most important legacies your operation can have in terms of really investing in the innovation locally, and again, shifting that balance and not transplanting solutions into environments that you don't fully understand. So I think that that could be something, and the braver organizations are the ones that really want to walk the talk, can really start to communicate around that and start showing that they're really supporting the local innovation systems and working with local innovators to try and deliver some of these solutions when technology is part of the solution. And I do believe it is quite often part of the solution, and will probably increasingly become so as more and more people are using it in their day-to-day lives. But it'll always be a blend. It'll always be a blend of the human technology combination. But where it is an important part of the solution, start using local innovators, and if they don't exist, invest.
Wonderful. Catherine, I'm coming back. Sorry, Max, you were leaning in. Did you want to jump in?
Maybe a very short 30-second comment, and that's something just I think what has been discussed, or I think what the panelists have brought up are excellent workarounds, keeping in mind that one of the base problems is that there is a key motivation of humanitarian actors, which is to please donors so that they can get the next round of funding and continue implementing and continue to survive. And there's not another baseline that's as easily measurable as simply being able to get the resources, being able to get the money to be able to do your job. And as long as that's there, it's true that that we can put more responsibility on the donors, asking them to put into their requirements that we respond more to the communities we're trying to serve. But as long as that basic mechanism is there, it's really going to be hard to change that dynamic.
I wonder then, just listening to all of you, whether we are falling in a very generalized way about this passing the buck with the accountability thing. And I'm reflecting on, Catherine, your comment earlier about bravery in leadership, having the balls, or I would suggest, propose it, having the uterus to stand up and argue for what's right, rather than, and it's a complex situation. There's so many, it's easy to sit here and wax lyrical about it, but I recognize the tension there. But I'm hearing a need for, I guess, courageous leadership, brave leadership at all levels. I'm not just saying it at decision maker levels. We have another question from the audience that I'd like to pose. Has anybody found interesting examples of community-based digital solutions, perhaps very localized Facebook groups or similar? And by community-based, I mean started by communities, not humanitarians. So interesting examples of community-based digital solutions started by communities, not humanitarians. And has anybody found interesting examples of this?
So these aren't new digital solutions, but I do know that when I was talking to my colleagues from Uganda, interestingly, they moved quite quickly to all remote-based kind of communication. In March, when the pandemic hit, by May, they were already getting feedback from people to say, we want face-to-face communication. We want face-to-face two-way communication, even though we know that the pandemic is making that difficult. That's our preference. And so the team worked really, they listened and they responded. And so they were looking for how can we, not just do message blasts, of information out, or IVR blasts. And so there were some locally set up WhatsApp groups between community health workers that already existed. So that's not like a new innovation or a platform, it was just an existing network that was using a global piece of technology. And so tapping into some of those existing networks and existing community groups to try and get the messages out through trusted people who were able to access people face-to-face, so that they could be responsive to that need for face-to-face and trusted communication.
I've come across many over the years, all very inspiring, and just like from the top of my head. So like, first of all, connectivity would often be a major challenge. Again, look to the community in terms of where are the needs and where are the possibilities to tap into the innovation and the knowledge in the community. So mesh networks, which allow for greater connectivity at community level. This started sprouting up in East Africa probably 15 years ago or something like that, to my knowledge at least. So really showing about the importance of connectivity. Also in East Africa and Kenya, there was some really good e-learning solutions, bringing e-learning to remote areas which had no connectivity. I've seen mobile apps developed in Mongolia to help nomads with weather forecasting. Pay-as-you-go electricity in West Africa. There are tons and tons of solutions out there being developed, by local communities. And that's why we need to learn to find them, to see them, and rather than looking for them, just really understand how to find them and learn from them, because they're all there. Like in India, Asia, everywhere, there's just so much going on. It's so dynamic. And we have a lot to learn.
So agree with that. You know, there's entire sort of research approaches that have been designed to find, amplify, connect local innovators, whether that's using positive deviance methods or local user innovation methods, etc. It'd be wonderful to see us sort of adopt that a lot more. Wonderful. I'm going to move on to a slightly different focus here. Disinformation and fighting disinformation. What are some of the solutions to fighting disinformation in humanitarian and fragile settings, if some digital platforms are actually part of that problem?
It's a tricky one. I'm happy to start with it. It's a very tricky one, and it's deserving of several days of discussion, perhaps, or more. But I think there was a good discussion in the previous panel around, you know, particularly from the colleagues from Internews, around dealing with misinformation and disinformation in particular. My own experience with that, or the one that's most relevant perhaps to this question, was in Myanmar, where there was just really, for me, it was quite a shocking experience just to witness the amount of disinformation that was circulating on Facebook without any intervention being made or any attempt to stop it or curb it. This is in the earlier days of the crisis. For me, that was without doubt an issue where intervention with the technology platform owners was required and should have been required. Should have been the case, because it was so prevalent and so dangerous and so corrosive in the society. But it was something on a scale we hadn't really seen before. But that's one aspect, and we're dealing with that not just in places like Myanmar, but in many different parts of the world right now. Generally speaking, I think there's a lot of great information out there, and a lot of great NGOs working at the civil society national level on dealing with these issues. Again, no less than the discussion on technology, that are dealing with these issues. In Myanmar and in Bangladesh, that was the case also, where local NGOs were fantastic partners in helping to really address that. And it can be through education, empowerment, awareness. There's many different ways of dealing with it, but I think there are resources out there to support organizations to come to grips with that. But it's fast moving, ever changing issue, and very difficult and complex one, I think, particularly when when it's deliberate disinformation.
Thank you, Paul. Does anybody else want to jump in with that question? Max?
Yeah, real quick, I do agree with Paul. I think there are things you can do through education programs to have people be media literate, and I think that's really key more and more in all of our cultures. I would say, you know, in the North, in the South, in the East, and the West, everywhere there needs to be much more emphasis on being media savvy. Trying to understand, you know, who could be behind certain messages, understanding who owns certain media, understanding the risks of anonymous sourcing, things like that. And I think that is absolutely key. And then the other one, you know, to go back to what I've been saying before, I really do think there is something to be said for good old-fashioned journalism, where through months and years of simply reporting the facts, there are certain media outlets in various countries where we are that are trusted because they do every once in a while say things that are not flattering for the government or not flattering for other stakeholders, other power brokers, and trying to be aware of what those media channels are when we arrive into these settings is really important if we want to try to use that to go against, try to be aware of that, to go against some of the disinformation, misinformation that could be in some of the contexts where we intervene.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit again, and I want to focus just on back to our question around our funders. What should funders, and by this we mean mainly philanthropic organizations, do to avoid slapdash techno-solutionism in the digital humanitarian context?
I mean, I think if there was a focus on outcomes rather than products, it would be a start. I think you know, a lot of the humanitarian innovation discussion has been very focused on products, because I think for a while, and it seems to have calmed down a bit now, but for a while there was such a focus on innovation that translated into, you know, funds, for example, one of which I'm involved with. And it's very hard for a fund to address a hugely systemic problem through proper systemic innovation. And so therefore, a lot of the focus tends to be on, you know, how do you find these little solutions and fund them and then try and scale them. And so I think rather than focusing maybe so much on innovation and its processes, because I think we as a sector are definitely not a very innovative sector, maybe inherently, at least with the big international structures as we know them. It might be good for donors to just think about things that might facilitate more innovative approaches. And so one of those would be, again, going back to flexible funding. One would be, you know, if we're looking for innovative approaches to accountability, what outcome do we want from accountability? And that goes back to what Catherine said in terms of how do you demonstrate that you're actually acting on feedback, and maybe in the process of that, there's a new innovative approach that you need to take to that. And I think also just maybe donors incentivizing stepping back where agencies don't need to put their name to something. And if I go back to this kind of scope LMMS example, and I'm sure there are many others, I think it would have been perhaps useful for donors to sort of more incentivize, you know, what local systems do exist and how are we supporting those systems to continue to function. But I think there is still this kind of branding issue along many, you know, links in the chain where that's not necessarily the case. So just a couple of ideas.
Maybe just to add to what Meg was saying, and, you know, thinking about the product issue, really focusing on challenges and the solutions to those challenges rather than the solutions looking for a challenge to fix. I remember talking to someone from a big donor who was in charge of their innovation department, and they had a big website of all of their their products that they had funded, and she told me it's like a closet of broken dreams. There's all these like funded products that are just like sitting there waiting to be like deployed to wherever to do something. And I think that by flipping the focus to look at what challenge are we actually trying to solve, has it already been solved locally, and supporting that, like Paul has said before, supporting those local ecosystems to grow and thrive. So inverting where the focus of funding is on the challenge rather than the growing the closet of broken dreams.
Oh, the closet of broken dreams. I'm so going to be using that phrase. It's often
right.
You've got the best sort of sound clips, I think, so far. One of the things I've often said in my work is that often when innovation as an institution of it, or the ecosystem, it happens at that periphery. The closet remains at the periphery of our institution. The learning happens at the periphery. It remains privileged learning, privileged insights, and it doesn't come back into the core of the system, the core of the institution. So nothing changes. We haven't learned how to bring everything back into the core because, as Meg said, the focus is on the product, not the outcome of what it is we're fundamentally working together to try and shift or transform. We've got a few more questions to get through. Audience, we've got some great conversation happening on the chat function in Zoom. Please jump in there. If you've got any questions you want to post to our panelists, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a comment box. So please do that, and then we'll get curated. That'll get curated for us. Panelists, I want to come back. There were a few backup questions that were put into our list that I'd like to throw at you now. And this one's a little, I don't know about, this one's a little bit provocative. So I'm already reacting emotively to this. So I'd be keen to see what you guys are saying. As technology companies are spending their own money, does it really matter that they are experimenting and trying out new ideas in a sector which frankly could use them? Which frankly could use those new ideas. So as technology companies are spending their own money, does it really matter that they are experimenting in our sector?
Yes, yes, it does matter, because I guess what we talk about when we talk about our sector is people. And I think this is one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big differences, I think, but, and why it just doesn't work to transplant wholesale the kind of innovation cycle approach from the private sector to the humanitarian space, is that we are bound by humanitarian principles, which we do still try to uphold, even if it's very, very difficult. And we have, there are ethical considerations there, as there are in other innovation spaces that deal with humans and people, and vulnerable people at that. So yes, I'm getting very emotional too. Yeah, I think it really matters.
Okay, we're going to go to Paul, and then I think Max.
Well, I'd have to agree with Catherine. I mean, I think I'd get into a lot of trouble if I didn't agree. But no, I mean, I'm not aware of any scenarios that would fit that bracket where technology companies wantonly throw money around experimenting. Maybe it's the case, but for me, that would be very unethical, unhelpful, potentially very damaging. I mean, at the end of the day, again, just coming back to that, I mean, it is about people, it's not about technology. So, I mean, I'm working with a technology company. We invest more of our time and energy in understanding the users of our technology than we do in designing the technology. That in many ways is the easy part. Understanding the user. So transferring that to this context is really understanding the community needs, the different groups, their different relationships with technology and how it will affect their lives. That's the important thing. And so you don't open that up to a technology company to experiment with. but you can bring the skill sets and knowledges and experience of the humanitarian organization together with a technology provider to, you know, try to design something that really can help and have an impact. And yes, of course, using local resources where possible and local knowledge, but with a view as well to globalizing it. You know, should it be successful, or, you know, so that it can be adapted and scaled, and maybe some, you know, important knowledge transfer in other regions as well, because that's definitely part of the efficiencies that we have to be cognizant of and can't ignore. You can't be just reinventing the wheel every time. But I would strongly agree that that is something we don't want to encourage.
Max, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I just want to second what has been said, and add another layer, which is that you know, we've learned through horrible mistakes over the years that good intentions alone don't cut it, and those horrible hard lessons that we've learned, I think we need to somehow be the guarantors that new actors that come into the sector take those into account, and don't repeat the same kind of errors that we've done in the past 30, 40 years. So absolutely, I think there's aspects of ethics, there's the human moderation that's absolutely necessary, and especially in examining our own biases and discovering how we might continue to be letting certain categories of people fall through the cracks. You know, we weren't immune by any means from the Me Too movement, but maybe we understand better what that application is for certain communities that we've been serving for years and years. Understanding what mechanisms are already in play of abuse, and maybe how to have the keys to not reinforce those through our interventions. And new actors, especially powerful actors coming into these settings, can make it all worse.
Absolutely. You know, I think that idea that people that are particularly vulnerable at a specific point in life are not test objects to be experimented on. And we have a lot of lessons ourselves in our work here in this sector. A really interesting question from the audience again. Humanitarian reforms seem to have a short attention span. We did AAP as reforming approaches, then we did cash. And now all the attention seems to focus on localization as the panacea. What does this tell us about our ability to drive actual change in the system, and how can we build across all these strands?
I think if I can touch on a bit the previous question to answer that one, because something I've just been reflecting on in terms of this discussion about the private sector and sort of businesses' involvement is, I think instead of thinking that we need to kind of unleash technology companies on affected populations in crises, I think there is a lot that the sector could learn from the business world in terms of our own inefficiencies and our own kind of ineffectiveness sometimes. And what I mean by that is, you know, we could, for example, take some lessons from some of these companies in terms of, you know, if you work for Goldman Sachs and you're not good at your job, you get fired. That never happens in our sector. Or, you know, some of the things that we might want to apply technology systems for, if we just applied them purely to the biggest humanitarian agencies internally in terms of how we manage projects and how we're accountable for funding and some of those things, that could be quite useful. I think to the next question, I sort of have a similar reaction. I think the reason why we sort of stumble over all these reforms is that we turn them into projects, and as soon as we do that, they lose a lot of their gusto in terms of changes they could make. We've been reflecting on this a lot internally about the kind of AAP, or Accountability to Affected Populations agenda, is that as soon as it became an acronym and a project, it kind of ceased to be actual accountability, and it started to be these little activities that were like, we're being accountable if everyone has a hotline, and then when everyone has a hotline, they say, okay, well, what's the next thing we should move on to? Gender, everyone needs a gender marker, and then what's the next thing? And I think that because they're not linked to these bigger reforms like the ones that we were talking about, you know, demanding of donors earlier or demanding of ourselves in terms of just listening to people and acting upon what they say and getting out of the way if they tell us that that's what they want. I think we're always going to be in this kind of process of busying ourselves with creating little reform activities to kind of try to solve problems that are much bigger than any of them can actually solve.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. Thanks, Meg. I actually want to come to, we've got about another 10 minutes. So please, audience, if you have more questions, put them through. But Meg, I want to come back to you again. GTS has been particularly critical of TripAdvisor type approaches to accountability. Why?
Sorry, I'm still always grappling for the mute button. Yeah, I mean, I think the TripAdvisor issue particularly has become this thing in the sector where, you know, every time there's a conference like this one, particularly some of the ones that are face-to-face, people get together afterwards and say, this could be solved by some sort of thing like TripAdvisor where people can just, you know, provide feedback on the humanitarian response en masse. I think the problem with that, I mean, specifically boils down to the fact that TripAdvisor works in a certain market setting where people are equal and people are empowered to provide that feedback. That's a condition for something like those platforms for work, and that just doesn't exist in the situations in which we're operating as humanitarians. But I think also sort of going back to what I said before, from everything that we've learned, the two parts to successful response-wide feedback, which is what those sorts of mechanisms are aiming for. One is the collecting of the information and the analysis and housing it somewhere, which is where, you know, some sort of platform can provide some assistance. But the other is actually just getting someone to listen and act on that feedback. And if you can't prove that that methodology has been rock solid and that your sample sizes were representative and that you went out proactively and collected that data, you're just going to get ripped apart by the decision makers who you're supposed to be influencing. And I think that when people get together and they say, oh, you know, and there's been various iterations of these TripAdvisor type things that have failed. And, you know, as Ground Truth, we've been very open with the facilitators of those about why we didn't think that they worked. It's because that whole process that has to go around a successful feedback system of winning buy-in and, you know, making people trust your data and trust where it comes from. If that doesn't exist, then there's no point collecting or sharing or doing anything with that data at all. You're just kind of wasting people's time. And I think those sorts of platforms kind of rely on voluntary feedback, which already we know is sort of generally missing half the story, or they rely on some sort of online format, which is never going to be representative. And so therefore, those who are kind of facilitating those processes are so far removed from understanding a situation in all of its nuance, but also from the decision makers who are able to act on it, that they seem rather to be, I guess, one, gimmicky, again, to use my word of the night, but also to kind of rely on more of a name and shame modality that is based on deeply flawed data and information that just has so many holes in it, than rather a kind of more, maybe less exciting, but more systemic way to really help to move the needle for accountability. But I'm happy to be proven wrong if one of them ever takes off.
Yeah, Meg, you've often talked a lot about, in this session, about the need for us to look much deeper at structural systemic issues which are resulting in these inequities and vulnerabilities in the first place, and that's not really where we spend a lot of our focus and money. And I wonder if it's because it's harder, it's less sexy, it's you know, we're not addressing power issues because it seems too complex, and you know, whenever your entire contributions today, that's the thing that I've been reflecting on in terms of what you're saying. Paul, Catherine, Max, was there anything that you wanted to contribute to that? Because if not, we've got a final question from our audience.
I would just very quickly add that, coming from sort of the older school of community engagement, it was always a blend again of channels and feedback mechanisms that working together gave you the fuller picture. So while a TripAdvisor type app might be, cool and look good and give you sort of fast information feedback, it is quite superficial. It's never going to be enough on its own, and you are missing so much by doing that. So I mean, I think some of the most successful ones have always been linked to things like that are really tailored to the information environment you're in, be it a talk radio show or forums or whatever it might be, and I don't think they'll ever be replaced.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. Now we've got one question, last question from the audience that I'm going to ask, and then I'll open up to last comments and reflections from our amazing panelists before we end the session. The question is, we talked about the 80s trend of sending tractors and food aid, which undermined local and regional food production. Can we now see the encroaching introduction of technology and financial technology into development and humanitarian work, risking the same impact on local technology markets?
I would say yes, for sure. I mean, to take that cash example, I mean, there are so many systems, financial systems that exist in countries. And yet there still seems to be this desire to kind of create bigger ones, therefore bypassing an entire market that we could be supporting. So, I mean, just at a very crude level, I would say yes, for sure, that's absolutely a risk.
I think if we're incorporating or introducing technological solutions without taking into account what's already there or what could potentially be there, then we are doing harm, because the opportunity cost has been lost on the local innovation system to really, develop something that's tailored for their environment. So I think that's a big mistake if that's happening, or where that's happening. And that would be a good concrete action that an organization like CDAC could try and drive, is to try and really put standards and recommendations in place to avoid that happening, so that we have solutions that are much more appropriate to the communities that they're there to serve and contributing to the economy potentially afterwards.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Catherine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add that, as well as existing local solutions, in my previous role with the Response Innovation Lab, which is a consortium between a number of agencies focused on humanitarian innovation, not only do solutions already exist within many countries, but networks, innovation ecosystems already exist. Investors exist locally. The whole environment is already there, emerging in many countries where we're working, not just these disparate solutions. So it's quite sophisticated already in some locations, and I think that the more that we can close the door on that cupboard of broken dreams of like outside innovations that were funded and kind of tried to be exported in, the better, and the more that we can support to nurture these existing ecosystems of innovation and technology, the better.
Amazing. What incredible contributions from our amazing panelists. We've come to the end of this incredibly intense but really substantive conversation. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for really leaning in with provocations and provocative ideas and really challenging us to do better and be better. I want to maybe open up to a final, very short, succinct reflection from each of our panelists about maybe some thoughts you would like to leave with us as we go forth and battle the rest of 2020 in our work. But some final thoughts and maybe reflections from all of you would be great. And maybe Max, I might start with you.
Final reflections on this subject. I would say I agree with the comments that we're saying that localization is not the panacea for for all these problems. A reminder that in a lot of the communities that we serve, I'm thinking of Niger and Central African Republic, for example. I think they only have internet penetration rate of 10%, even in zones where where it's fairly stable. So when we're talking about technology, we do need to take into account the reality of what's going on in the field. The limits of taking that into account, of course, are the challenges that the entire aid sector is confronting right now. The big centralization that has happened over the past 40 years in the big aid agencies are mostly Western, repeats the same power structures. It's the same kind of discussions we've been having in a lot of these types of venues. But just realizing that in the domain of accountability and technology, there's still a big gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Thank you so much, Max. Meg, I might go to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess as a final thought, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that almost every conclusion on this panel has come down to a need to listen more and to ask questions and to apply nuance and critical thought. And I think if that's the starting point in both our activities and our advocacy, increasingly, as applies to technology or accountability or other, I think then we'll be more likely to be steering ourselves away from the problematic dream cupboards and more on the right direction towards some of these reforms that we keep talking about.
Thank you, Meg. Paul, and then final words from Catherine.
So just like in terms of the theme about the digital fix, yeah, there is no silver bullet. Anybody who says that digital will provide you the solution to particular challenges, particularly linked to community engagement, they're wrong. It's not. There's never going to be a standalone digital solution, but blended together and guided by the community, yes, it can really increase exponentially sometimes your impact if done properly. But understanding the community, understanding the people is the first and most crucial step, because they will guide you in terms of what can work and what is most relevant in their particular situation. And where possible, let's get some guiding principles in place that when a digital solution is needed, use it to support and invest in local expertise, local knowledge, stimulate the local economy, and leave that legacy behind. I think that for me is extremely important part, and something that the aid world has really missed out on over the last 100 years or however long it's been going on.
Excellent point, Paul. And Catherine, final notes. Well, my other panelists have really covered a lot of my thoughts, but I think context is really king, and asking communities how they want to be communicated with, what channels they want to use for two-way communication. That's where our answers are going to be in terms of what digital platforms are appropriate. And also just to note that the communities are so diverse, so it's not going to ever be, as Paul said, just one solution. We will need to use a number of different platforms for two-way communication. There will be different preferences within each community, within each household, for how people want to receive information and give feedback. So we're always going to be needing to use a blend of different channels, and that blend of channels might change over time as the context changes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for really leaning in, Max, Meg, Paul, Catherine, to our wonderful participants for all your really provocative and deep questions. What I'm taking away from this amazing session is curiosity and humility trumps leading and winning. And that's probably what we need for our very complex futures emerging in front of us. So thank you. I hope everybody found this session wonderful. I know I certainly did. Thank you for joining us. Please do join us tomorrow at 12 p.m. UK time for the final day of this wonderful forum. And thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you, panelists, for your wisdom and guidance.